I was camping in the middle of nowhere in Washington. Not like an official campground, just way out in the forest where I wouldn't have expected another human for miles. One night, I wake up and hear something. I open my tent, and there is a guy sitting by where my fire had been right outside my tent. Nothing strange about the guy, just a normal looking dude, sitting there a couple feet from my tent. No backpack or anything with him, just a guy. He saw me open the tent, and his eyes got big, like he had just seen a ghost, and he took off. It shook me up pretty badly, but over the next day, I was able to put it out of my mind. After writing it off as just some strange occurrence, and a guy that was maybe high or something, and had somehow managed to set up a camp not far from mine. Then, 2 days after that, and 10 to 15 miles away in a totally different direction, that nobody could take the same path as on accident, I was sitting by the fire that night, and I started to hear noises that I got more and more convinced were a person. I called out to them, and out of the darkness someone was like, "Yo, do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?" I said no, I don't even think that's a real place there. They kept talking from just out of my line of vision. I tried to see them with my flashlight, aimed that way, and sounded kind of scared and not wanting to piss off a potentially crazy person. I pointed the flashlight somewhere else. After like 15 minutes of being freaked out, and this person just talking and asking completely random questions, from the darkness, it sounded like the voice had gotten closer. So I ended up shining my light that way again. And it was the same dude who had been outside my tent 2 nights before. He must have followed me about 15 miles over 2 days, because there is no way he could have ended up in the same spot as me, as big as that wilderness is. No possible way. As soon as I shined my light on him, he took off again. I started to chase him but didn't want to get lost in the wilderness in the dark, so I stopped quickly after about 100-200 feet. This one couldn't be written off, because the only way he could have been in both places is if he was following me. I decided that the trip was over first thing in the morning, and ended up hiking back out over 3 days, always doubling back, trying to throw anyone following off my trail, and sometimes hiding and waiting to see if he would come by following me. I really can't describe how terrifying it was to feel like I was being hunted through the woods, and to actually have to brainstorm on things I could do to best avoid ending up being killed. On the first night of hiking out, twice, I heard what sounded like a person walking circles outside my tent. But by the time I got the courage to look out, nobody was there. On the second night, I heard what I thought was an animal making noises at first in the distance, but I slowly decided that it sounded more like a human making animal calls. But it also could have been an actual animal, but I didn't actually see the guy again, but it really sounded like a person making noises. I basically cried when I finally got back to my vehicle. The relief was so strong. To this day, this was the most terrifying experience I ever had. I have no idea who the guy was or what his intentions were, but I just can't really articulate just what a terrifying few days it was. The whole situation was pretty intense, especially given that it went on for a few days. Like, imagine the feeling of noticing that there is someone following you in a dark alley, then stretch this out into 3 days, and make it to where you have to sleep in the alley, and that's exactly what this experience was like. The feeling wasn't of being scared, but it was this constant knot in my stomach that someone out there was hunting me for 3 days. I grew up in Ohio in the 70s, and me and my childhood friend Joe were outside all the time we could manage. Joe lived on a farm that was next to a pretty big forest, and my parents would drop me off in the morning, and we would stay in the woods all weekend. We would only come out for school. We would be out there building shelters, traps, practice making fire with sticks. When we got to be in high school, we got this notion to pull a Stand By Me. This was based on the movie of the same name that had just come out. The idea was that we would walk the railroad tracks out into the country, but instead of looking for a dead body, we would find cool bridges to fish from and camp a little ways off the tracks. Of course, we knew this was dangerous and we would likely be trespassing. We had a lot of fun. We did find beautiful rivers. We discovered bridges no one went to. We fished. At night, we camped in the woods just near the tracks and made small hidden fires. Nothing bad ever happened. It was the best. In fact, it was so fun we did it a bunch of times and never had a problem. After high school, me and Joe went our own separate ways. We both ended up leaving home, but we always stayed in touch and always tried to coordinate visits, so we would see each other often. Well, one summer, in the mid-90s, it worked out that we were both in town for about a week. We would do stuff with family in the day, and at night, we would catch drinks at the bar or sit outside Joe's house around a fire and talk about the good old days. One night, me and Joe got to talking about our Stand By Me trips. Remembering these moments and drinking beer are a hell of a mix. Soon, we decided to take a day, walk the rails, camp one night, and walk home. When the day finally came, we started early in the morning. We had my wife drop us off in our old spot, where we used to always start, right outside our hometown. She thought this was absolutely crazy and made sure to mention it. When she pulled away, Joe said that instead of walking the usual way, we should take the opposite direction, just to be adventurous. We knew the land well. We had a map, so I gave a what the hell, and off we went. The day went fine. It was fun and a little sad, but in a good way. We found a bridge and sat on the edge, smoked the joint and moved on. We had no fishing gear, but we brought some canned food and more stuff. Before the night arrived, we picked a spot to camp. It was a thick forest area, trees on every side of the train tracks, so you felt like you were in a tunnel. We also brought small hammocks to sleep on, but before we set them up, we decided to do a little scouting of the area. Now, this is also something we used to do in the old days as well. We would walk the area around a little bit to make sure some dude's house wasn't just over a hill and we were actually camping in their yard. We walked maybe 100 or so feet into the woods, and we also went up a small incline. We figured if we didn't see anything from on top of this short hill, we would be fine. But when we got to the top, we saw an old building down at the bottom, about 100 yards into the woods. It was barely visible. We pondered over what to do. We both assumed it was a sugar shack or something, because there didn't appear to be a clear road into it. From where we were standing, everything was quiet. No movement. Nothing could be seen. No lights. We decided to walk a little closer just to make sure. We came down the hill very slowly, and as we neared the building, we saw it wasn't a sugar shack at all. It was an old church. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. It was a squat, sagging building whose wooden planks were almost black from years of rot. A cross still stood on top of the place. None of the windows had glass and there were no doors, just open doorways. We got close enough to see inside, and there were rows and a section up in the front for a preacher to stand. We didn't go all the way in. We didn't want to. Beyond all that, there was no sign of anyone else. No footprints. No roads. It was an abandoned church. We quickly left and went back up the hill to our spot we had picked to camp. Having a hill between us and the church made us feel better, but we were still a little uneasy. We chalked it up to the natural creepiness seeing a church in the middle of the woods. Besides, at this point, it was dusk, and we just decided to rig up our hammocks and go to sleep and move on early morning. When the night came, we were laying down, and we began to hear something in the direction of the church. Our conversation about it went a little like this. Do you hear that? What the fuck is that? It sounds like people singing. And it did sound just like singing. We both slid right out of our hammocks and hunkered down, straining to hear more. We listened for a minute or two, and the singing continued. Finally, we decided to creep back up the hill and see if we could spy where the sound was coming from. We could still move very quietly in the woods from the old days. It was second nature to us. The moon was barely out, but it provided enough light so you wouldn't walk right into a tree. It was near pitch black, and we didn't use flashlights as we crept slowly up the hill, and we didn't even speak. When we got to the top, we saw a light in the distance. It was coming from the church, and the singing was coming from inside. Joe and I put our heads close together and had a conversation that boiled down to this. Can you believe this shit? The light looked to be candlelight from the way it flickered, and even though we tried, we couldn't make out what was being sung. It sounded like church music, but in a different language. We sat and watched for a while, trying to see who was there, but we only saw shadows. We had no intention of getting closer either. We had a lot of space between us, and we aimed to keep it that way. The singing continued for a bit, and then it stopped. After that, a male voice began to chant. I was already freaked out, but this voice scared the shit out of me. It sounded like some Old Testament preacher you see in movies. But again, it was like he was speaking in a different language, because we couldn't even understand a single word. Eventually, it got to where the single male voice would say something and then a bunch of voices would answer in song. This lasted for a while, and then they all broke into this long, sustained crying that just kept getting louder. It got so loud and so disturbing that I covered my ears. Then, it finally stopped. At this point, I was just getting ready to say, "Let's get the fuck out of here, man," when Joe put a hand on my shoulder and hissed, "They're coming out." We were far enough away that we couldn't make them out really well, but what we could see was a line of figures walking out the doorway, all holding hands in a single file. We could see some of them had flashlights. They began to sing again, and the light from the flashlights began to move towards us and the hill. That's when we booked it back down to our campsite, grabbed our shit, and ran to the tracks. Once there, we ran down the tracks in the direction we had come from. After a few minutes, we stopped and looked back. We saw lights coming down the hill. They were moving weird, like whoever was holding them was also shaking them. We continued to run and walk as fast as we could. We eventually stopped seeing the lights and came to a road. By our map, we knew a small town was about 15 minutes down, and we walked there, got to a 24-hour gas station, and called my wife to come get us. My wife and all her other friends just thought it was kids messing around, but I heard those voices, and they sure as hell didn't sound like kids to me. Not sure who those people were, but it was definitely the creepiest thing that has ever happened out in the woods. I try to live my life without too many regrets. I had highs and lows like everyone else in life, sure, but I do what I can to not worry too much about what could have happened if I made a different choice, if I maybe hadn't taken the road less traveled. Everyone makes the best decisions they can with the information they have available to them at the time. Going through all the what ifs is crazy, because the only way you would have made a different choice is if you had some other detail, which of course you didn't. You can never be exactly sure what the sequence of events might have looked like if you gone right instead of left. And yet, there is one choice I made, one road that I took, that I just can't help but wonder how things might have turned out if I had only done something different. My job has me move around pretty often. I'm not going to get into what I do. That has no bearing on the story. But a couple of years ago, I was working in Philadelphia and living on the other side of the Delaware River in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. I'm originally from northwestern Pennsylvania, and this was the closest I had been to home since I moved out of college. So I took the chance to go see my parents whenever I could. I knew I would be moving again before long, and my folks aren't getting any younger. So I try to find a weekend every month or so to make the 7-hour trip to visit them. If I had been thinking about it when I was looking for places to rent, maybe I would have tried to live on the west side of Philadelphia instead of this side in Jersey to avoid the rush hour. But by the time I realized, the lease was signed and there wasn't much I could do. The drive to my hometown was pretty boring. I would take the Ben Franklin Bridge across the river, head up I-476 for an hour or so, then a long slog across basically the entire expanse of Pennsylvania on I-80 before another hour north of I-79. The only thing about the drive was how long it would take me to get through Philly, because once I got on the 476 extension, I could predict my ETA within 5 or 10 minutes. My second summer in Jersey, I had taken 2 weeks off and planned on spending the second week back home. Things changed that first Wednesday though, because a big storm came by and knocked out power in a good part of the area where I was living. Dealing with 90-degree heat with no AC wasn't something I felt like spending the first half of my vacay doing. So after one uncomfortable sweaty night, I let my parents know that I was heading over a few days earlier. I should have left first thing in the morning, but because I had a couple of things to take care of before heading out, by the time I finally got on the road that Thursday, it was past lunchtime and getting on mid-afternoon. For whatever reason, the traffic in Philly was heavy, and by the time I finally got through town, I was a good hour behind schedule. Still, based on my timeline, I figure I'll still be able to make it early enough to grab a dinner and beer with my dad and brother before cashing in for the night. There were two things I hadn't taken into consideration. One was the number of other folks that, apparently, had the same idea to get out of town that I did, and that the road construction must have sprung up in the time since my last trip home. The interstate highway system is a heck of a thing. Being able to zip along at 65-70, or in some remote places like West Texas even faster than that, makes cross-country travel take a fraction of the hours it would otherwise. I can't tell you the number of times my folks always talk about the days before the interstate, when going to see friends outside of DC would take almost twice as long as it does now. What's truly remarkable to me, though, is that even though the entire system of highways was built start to finish in a mere 35 years, it sure seems like when parts of it go under construction, they stay that way forever. Traffic was heavy, but moving, and I was making decent time until I saw the first orange warning signs, letting me know that 4 lanes were reducing to 3, and then 2, and then 1. There were hundreds of cones stretched down the road as far as the eye could see. And see, I could, as the cars in front of me reached a complete and total standstill. It was one of the worst deadlocks I had ever been in. Seriously, I think I moved about a mile in about an hour. After about 3 hours, my stomach started grumbling. With an exit just ahead and no end to the traffic jam in sight, I got off and found a diner to grab some dinner. Even if traffic picked up, I still had a solid 5 hours of driving ahead of me. So at that point, I knew for sure it was going to be pretty late that I was getting in. After finishing eating, I got back on the road. Things looked like they were picking up for a couple of miles. But then, I came up to the back end of a jam and was right back to waiting. We were moving a little bit better, I think averaging about 5 miles an hour at this point. But as the sun started edging towards the horizon, I pulled out my phone and started to see if Google could point me in any kind of workaround. It's a funny thing about human nature. Most of us don't like to sit still. Studies at airports show that people would rather walk further to baggage claim to get their luggage, even if the total time would have been less if they had a slightly longer wait at plane side. Well, the power of the internet appeared to be in my favor. Even though I-80 still showed the dark red band for another 50 miles or so, there was a southbound country road coming up a few miles, and a northbound a couple after that. Both of these roads looked like they let me bypass the worst of the traffic. Since I spent the better part of the day sitting on the road, my patience was about worn out, and I opted to take the southbound road. Even though the app told me it would take about 30 minutes longer to get to my parents' house, I just wanted to get moving again, and reasoned that at this rate, it might take me more than a 35-minute difference to get to the northbound. And that is a choice that I will remember until the day I die. I made the turnoff and felt my mood improve. The signs changed, limiting my speed between 35 and 40 miles an hour. But even that seemed like flying compared to the logjam I spent the last several hours in. The drive was interesting. The road was starting to get a little twisty, with plenty of changes, as it curved up and around the hills of central Pennsylvania. It took me on a general southwest road, but turned and doubled back on itself enough that for the first 30 minutes or so, I had views of the stalled traffic on I-80. Pretty soon after that though, just about the time that the sun was just dipping down beneath a couple of hills in my rear view mirror, the road took a long curve and carried me down and away out of sight of the interstate. Now, something that a lot of people don't know is how big of a state Pennsylvania is. There are plenty of bigger ones, but Pennsylvania is really big, and it's also remote, isolated. The translation of the name means Penn's Woods. After all, the Blair Witch Project didn't have to embellish that aspect of the state. The fact that you could head into the woods and walk for dozens of miles in any way without seeing anything like another human being was pretty creepy. It's got a decent number of big cities. Pittsburgh and Philly both have enough of a population to support major sports teams, but away from those centers of development, there's a whole lot of nothing, and trees, and dark, and lonely roads. Such was the road I was traveling that night, winding through the twists and turns of the Appalachian foothills. I moved around a lot. I mentioned I traveled through most of the states anyways. I sometimes used to wonder, when I would be driving along a patch of asphalt, surrounded by only untamed wilderness, what it must have been like to build such a road. What was it like before man had intruded with our civilization and our machines? What used to live there? But I don't wonder anymore. Not ever since that night, when I made a left instead of right. The road continued to twist back and forth, up and down. As I went deeper into the foothills, the trees grew thicker, branches from either side of the road reaching over and almost touching, forming a natural canopy 20 feet up that blocked out much of my view of the sky and the stars above. I drove with my high beams on, because the idea of streetlights had never entered the minds of whoever built this road. The painted lines were old and not well cared for. I never been a good navigator. My parents used to say it was because when I was a kid, my nose was always pushed into a book during car rides. But I think it's because I'm just bad at it. So it was that. There was no way possible I could be lost, as there were no other roads that I could have possibly turned onto and gotten off track. I also found myself more frequently checking my phone to ensure I was still on the right path, which is how I almost ran into the other car. My mind was wandering, thinking about the fact that my signal bars had dropped and remained at 0 for the last 20 minutes, and what possible implications that would mean if I came across some kind of emergency. I raised my eyes back to the road after Google Maps confirmed for the 20th time that I was still on the right path. That's when my brain took a beat to process that I was approaching a vehicle stopped in the middle of the lane. I slammed my foot on the brake. I stopped in time, but not by much, with maybe 5 feet separating my hood from the other car's rear bumper. My heart was pounding in my chest as adrenaline coursed through my body, but my fear quickly gave way to anger. Seriously, what the hell was this guy doing? Not only was he stopped in the middle of the road, but all his lights were off. If I didn't have my high beams on, there was a good chance I wouldn't have seen him, even if I wasn't checking my phone. I could feel my heart beating in the vein on the side of my neck. I'm not somebody who struggles with road rage, and after a couple of quick seconds, I managed to get a hold of myself, not wanting to outright alarm anyone that might still be in the vehicle. I shifted into reverse and backed up about 20 feet, popping my emergency lights on. That's when I started noticing a few strange things about the stopped vehicle, more than just the fact that the lights were out. Of course, it was stopped in the middle of the road, but that wasn't unreasonable, since there wasn't any shoulder that the driver could have moved onto. The strange thing, though, was that the doors were open, those on the driver's side crossing over slightly onto the other lane. And even more was that I saw that an item was dropped out onto the road by the rear driver's side door, something that appeared to be a child's stuffed animal. I considered my options, and after a few seconds, decided that I would have to go against my better judgment to just keep on my merry way and head outside to get a better idea of what was going on. I said earlier my job doesn't have anything to do with the story, which is mostly true. But before you judge my choices, it bears mentioning that I spent some time in the military. An obligation to help people has been drilled into me over the years, and I've seen enough things while deployed to feel I could handle myself. And so I got out of my car, but kept it running. I popped the trunk to grab the flashlight I keep there and left my headlights on so I could see what I was doing. I looked up and down the road, hoping to see signs of other cars approaching, but no luck. I called up to the other car as I cautiously started my approach, circling around to the left, to the middle of the road so I'll be able to get a look inside before I got too close. Anyone there? No answer. My headlights were helping, but there were enough shadows to still hide the car's interior. Shining my flashlight, though, easily determined that no one was inside. I moved closer, stopping down by the rear door to pick up the falling object off the ground. It was a child's toy, just like I thought, a stuffed rabbit, with patches showing signs of frequent love. I frowned. If the folks traveling in the car had hitched the ride with somebody passing by, they would have taken the rabbit, or the kid would have been throwing a fit. I shut the rear door and moved up to the front. I put my hand on the hood and found it was still warm to the touch. That means it couldn't have been here too long. I slid into the driver's seat to try and figure out if there was some kind of mechanical issue that would have forced the car to stop, and was startled to find a set of keys still dangling from the ignition. Pressing the brake, I turned the key and the engine started right up. Headlights and the interior light in the roof springing to life. Fuel, oil, temperature, battery, all the gauges looked good. Not even a check engine light. Strange. Very strange. Then I saw the purse in the passenger seat. I picked it up, a normal brown shoulder bag, and briefly rummaged around before finding a wallet inside. Everything appeared to be intact. About $40 in cash, a couple credit cards, gym membership, Sam's Club card, the driver's license named the owner as Mary Walker, a pretty blonde that had just turned 30 the month before. There were a few pictures showing Mary in stage poses, sitting on a blanket under a tree. A huge, bearded lumberjack of a man hugged her from behind. A small ponytail girl with a goofy, over-exaggerated smile on her lap. That's when I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. A shiver running down to the base of my spine. Something was very wrong with this situation. I put everything back in the purse and returned it to the seat. I turned off the car and got out, shutting the driver's door behind me. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and dialed 911, holding it over my head to try to get a connection with no luck. Cursing softly, I jammed the red end call button and moved around to the passenger side of the car. I played my flashlight around and noticed that some of the foliage at the edge of the road was bent and trampled, like someone had walked through it. I didn't have enough woodcraft to be able to judge how long ago they might have passed, but even then, I couldn't imagine any scenario for why they would have gone wandering away. Shining my light into the woods, the beam only extended maybe 30 feet through the trees before being effectively swallowed by the greedy blackness. Looking at all the flat grass, at the stuffed rabbit in my hand, then at the dark trees crowding maliciously, my thoughts came back and forth between what I should do. I made up my mind. I had been trained to help people. It was hardwired into my system. There was a child somewhere in the woods. I raised my foot to take a step onto the path, and that's when a white flicker of movement entered the very edge of my flashlight beam. It was Mary Walker. She was naked and walking stiffly, unnaturally, her arms swaying out of sync with the rest of her body, like a puppet being manipulated by somebody who's not an experienced puppeteer. "Hello?" her voice called out. "Anyone there?" That's when more shapes came into view behind her, shambling along. Here, the bearded man who must have been Mary's husband, then their little girl, owner of the well-loved rabbit, both moving as strange as their wife and mother. And now, I could tell there were more, many more, their forms out of the direct light, but so many they caused the darkness to pitch and swell with their strange, staggering passage. Their voices a chorus. "Hello? Hello?" they called. "Anyone there?" Echoing back the questions I was asking only a few short minutes ago when I approached the abandoned car. I took a stumbling step back, away from the woods and the approaching figures. I ended up tripping onto the walker's car, but at that moment, I shone my light up into the pitch recess of the branches, and in doing so, I could just make out, barely, a sort of darkness figure that was crouched, hidden in the upper limits, a void even darker than the trees. Was it my imagination? Those lines of pure blackness that extended from that concealed mass that seemed to pierce the flesh of Mary Walker and her kin, and the countless other shapes moving in sync with them. That's when I sprinted back to my vehicle, engine still running. Hello? I shifted to reverse, keeping enough of my head to avoid running off the road as I completed a 3-point turn. Anyone there? I took a glance in my rearview mirror. The pale form of Mary Walker stood still just at the edge of the forest where the trees met the road. One hand was raised, signaling me to return, or perhaps waving goodbye. Her face was a mask of confused sadness. I pressed the gas and drove back the way I came. I didn't look back again. The rest of the trip was a fog. At some point after I made it back to the interstate, I called my parents. I let them know that I wouldn't be getting in until late. I drove on autopilot, the traffic jam having cleared while I was off. I thought about calling 911, but I didn't. What would I tell them, and to what end? There was no one left to be helped. I try not to go through life with too many regrets, wondering about what if. But this one, this choice, what if I had left earlier in the day? What if I hadn't stopped for dinner? Maybe I would have still gone left. Maybe I would have been there in time to help the walkers. Maybe I would have been taken by that black thing that was fishing in the darkness. What if I had gone right? Would I still be ignorant, going through life, unknowing that there are these things out there? I try not to think of it too often, but every now and then, all these thoughts turn to the stuffed rabbit. It wasn't until I reached my parents' house that night that I realized I still had that rabbit clutched in my hand. I used to wonder, before man brought our roads and civilization, what was the wilderness like? What lived there? But I don't think about these things no more. I can't afford to. At least, if I don't want to wake up screaming. There are things out there in the woods, in the darkness, in places that humans still have not ventured out to. So be careful when you're out traveling, going into these country roads, and that no matter how bad the traffic is, always stick to the interstate. This just happened a few days ago, and I'm extremely shaken up. Some backstory first. I live on the second floor of a 3-level apartment. We have a crawl space that connects all the apartments. We aren't sure why it's there, but we all have stuff in it, and none of us would ever even attempt to go inside of it, so we still felt pretty safe. The other night, the sun was going down, but it wasn't pitch black out or anything yet. I'm walking through my living room when I see a short woman on my fire escape, looking into my windows. This is extremely bizarre, considering it's still semi-light out, and she must have literally gotten onto a fire escape somehow. We have 2 windows that the fire escape reaches, and she was looking in both, but didn't see me. I crawled onto the ground and my heart was racing as I watched her try to open the windows. I didn't know what the fuck to do because my phone was in the other room. After what seemed like forever, she finally left. I went into my room to get my phone to text my landlord and call the cops. I came back into the living room and was looking out the windows to see if I could locate her, when all of a sudden, I hear a weird noise coming from the ceiling. We had one of those tile ceilings made out of separate slabs of cork or wood. I looked up to see one of the slabs lifted up, and 2 eyes were staring at me. I have no clue how she got into the crawl space so quickly, but I grabbed the nearest thing next to me, which was a broom, and started hitting her with it through the ceiling, and called the cops as soon as she crawled away. They showed up and searched the place and didn't find her until a few days later, when she was on someone else's fire escape. The cops said she was definitely on some hard drugs, and that she was very violent. I'm glad she's gone. This was the scariest experience I ever had. Imagine some crazy lady coming through the ceiling as you're laying down in bed tonight, looking up. It was a Sunday early in the morning. I live in the suburbs, but my parents own a farm that I enjoy going to because I get to see my dog. Her name is Molly. She's a mutt, but she's not a tiny dog by any means. At that time, I felt very safe around her and would often take her for walks in the forest that was nearby. The day started off like any other. Me and my dad got in the car, drove around for a while, and arrived at the farm. I got out of the car and hugged Molly. My parents always got angry when I hugged her. This was simply because I would smell like her for the rest of the day. I put a leash on her and asked my dad if I could take her for a walk. He always thought that we would just go down a road and back, but I always found it more interesting to take her to the forest. I always felt a certain kind of peace and relax there that was unmatched by anything else. So we took a turn and headed to the forest. When we got there, I would take her leash off so she could explore on her own. Most of the time I would carve my name into the trees or look for anything else interesting. I was playing baseball with some rocks and a wooden leg, most likely from an old table, and then I heard it. Molly was barking at something. This wasn't normal when we were in the forest. I thought it was a fox or some other animal, so I quickly grabbed the wooden leg like a weapon. I knew that if it was a fox, I would attack it, but I had a sense of security when I was holding it. I called out to Molly, 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 but she kept barking. This was actually very strange for me, because she always came to me when I called her. I followed the sound of her barks and stumbled across a scene that I'll never forget. There was a man, most likely in his late 50s, half naked, carrying a large machete in one hand and holding moonshine in the other. This was the first time that I stumbled across someone in the woods, especially someone half naked and carrying a big-ass machete. He was completely ignoring Molly and hacking away at the ground for some reason. I didn't really know how to handle the situation. Even now, I still don't know how I would handle it. "Sir, are you okay?" I said, confused. I don't think I understood the seriousness of the situation at the time. He turned around, revealing his face. He had blue eyes I had never seen to this day. I could see them so well because they were wide open. "Come here, boy. Look what I dug up." I was afraid if I didn't listen to him, he would start chasing after me, and that was something I wanted to avoid at all costs. I got closer, but kept a good distance. I didn't see anything except for an empty hole. He returned to hitting the ground with his machete, occasionally taking sips from the bottle. I used this window of time to get my dog, and started walking away slowly, as to not notify him that I was leaving. But then, I took one final glance at the man, and this time, his head was dug deep in the hole. I was intrigued, so I kept looking. I know how stupid of me, but when he finally got up from the ground, I was shocked when I saw him carrying a bone in his mouth. I have no idea what animal it belonged to, if it even did belong to an animal. That's when I saw enough and started running with my dog. As we ran, I heard him laughing, and then I saw something flying from the corner of my eye. It was that damn machete. I heard him yell, "God damn it." This actually made me run even faster. I know the forest very well, so I wasn't afraid of getting lost. I went through branches and bushes until I got out of the forest. But I didn't stop running until I arrived at the garage, where my father was testing out lights on our tractor. I didn't tell him a single thing about the man, since I was afraid that he would get angry and wouldn't allow me to walk Molly anymore. Needless to say, I never, ever went to that forest alone, ever again. I've been running in these woods for as long as I can remember, but this encounter makes me change my mind. The story begins at around 6:30 p.m. I had finished eating and decided to go on a run, as I always do. I always use the same path, cross the street, run for about a mile, and pass the gate that goes into the forest. Something important to note is that the trail I used in the forest is separated about halfway through. One path is paved and the other isn't. I always go into the unpaved trail first and then turn into the paved one after about 3 miles. Nothing really ever goes wrong. I meet some people walking their dogs, but other than that I'm pretty much alone. At least, I thought I was. I had been running for a while now when I heard a notification coming from my phone. A notification from AirDrop. Since I didn't want to make it look like I was worried, I kept running for a couple of minutes and then stopped to change the music. I opened the AirDrop dreadfully. Who the hell was sending me stuff? I was pretty sure I was alone. I clicked on the drop and my heart sunk. It was a Snapchat picture of me running with the caption, "You look good." I didn't turn around. Instead, I kept running like nothing happened until I got to a certain point. You see, the forest is surrounded by a fence to stop children from coming in unsupervised. And I didn't like that rule when I was little. So my friends and I cut a hole in it. When I was aligned with that hole, I quickly turned and buried myself into the forest, aiming for my escape. I could hear something behind me, and I still didn't turn back. When I finally got to the hole, I jumped through it, and absolutely booked it to the fire station that was a couple streets down. The last thing I could hear when leaving the forest was an angry huff, and metal scraping against metal. I still don't know who it was or what they wanted from me, but I will never run in this forest again. Late at night, I go to the bathroom multiple times, but for the past 4 days, every time I go to leave, I can see myself still standing in the mirror from the corner of my eye. It's like the other me is watching me leaving the bathroom. It terrifies me to the point where I almost run out without looking directly at the mirror. I never told my husband about it because I didn't want to acknowledge it out loud. But today, I took a nap in our bed while he sat up in the chair next to it, watching TV. When I woke up, he told me that he had seen me sit up and crawl backwards to the edge of the bed and stand up in front of our bedroom door from the corner of his eye. He thought it was weird, but I got up like that because I'm in the last month of my pregnancy and I can't really move so well without it hurting. So he tried talking to me, but when I didn't answer, he said that he looked at the door to find me not there and still sleeping in bed. I got really creeped out, and I finally told him about what I had been seeing in the bathroom. He thought it was creepy as well, but didn't want to really talk about it anymore, because he thinks it will give whatever it is power or energy. I have no idea what it wants, or why we have both seen it, but if you have any idea, please let me know. Also, as you're getting ready for bed tonight, walking out the bathroom. Take a peek behind you towards the mirror and see if your own reflection is looking at you as you walk out. They say that if you come face to face with your doppelganger, it's an omen or warning of death for both you and your twin. Because of this, if you see a replica of yourself, run for your life. If you keep seeing your doppelganger, chances are that your days are numbered because you'll soon come to an end. There are many stories regarding encounters with doppelgangers, none of them pleasant. Often, a person does not actually see their own doppelganger, but someone else does. Can you be at two places at once? Well, of course not, but it's a very strange feeling when someone who knows you very well insists that they saw you just 30 minutes ago and you were nowhere in the vicinity. Imagine this happening time and time again. You'll soon go insane. The story goes that a doppelganger will precede the arrival of the real person. Many stories explaining their experiences with these things have this in common. Perhaps he's one step ahead of you. I remember one Sunday morning, my brother and I were watching TV and someone knocked on the door. We lived in an apartment that was empty. The owner hadn't rented the second floor. It was a 2-bedroom apartment with a kitchen and a bathroom by the door. A small apartment but with a big window that faces out to the door. So when I heard someone knock, I checked the window and I saw my father. So I thought. I was going to the door to open it. When I was going to unlock the door, my mother pulls me away and screams at me to not open the door because I didn't know who it was. I told her I saw my dad and she freaked out. Going to the window and checking then checking the peephole. She started to get terrified and she said to go to the room in the apartment and to not come out. She went and woke my dad. My dad got up angry and confused. We told him what we saw, and the man was still knocking at the door. My dad screamed, "Who is it?" No answer. He said he will call the cops, but no response. While my dad was busy screaming at him, we saw that he was just standing still in the front of the door. So my mom took us to the furthest room from the door, while my dad got ready to open the door with a metal bat. Once he did, the man was gone. My dad goes out looking everywhere around the apartment for him. The apartment door was a heavy metal door, and I always was heard when someone comes in and out, but we heard nothing that morning, and nothing when my dad opened the door. We heard no footsteps either, but my brother, my mother, and I saw that man that looked exactly like my father. Both times that my family experienced doppelgangers, the doppelgangers refused to respond when spoken to. The first was my sister's doppelganger, who my brother told to go downstairs for lunch. She didn't answer. When my brother walked downstairs, he instantly saw my actual sister wearing a different shirt. She couldn't have passed my brother so quickly because the staircase led directly to our dining area. The second was my own doppelganger, who stood at my door at 12 p.m., mute, not saying a word, and staring at my sister, who was using the computer. And I wasn't actually home until 4 p.m. later that day, after school. My sister didn't know that until she asked me why I was just staring at her, without emotion, and dark eyes, earlier, around noon. I was in middle school, I was at a friend's apartment she lived in with her mom. Her mom was pretty cool and let us party there, and she was always at work for long, late hours. And there was a group of us there, maybe 6 people or so. Everyone was in the living room, except for this couple who were in the mom's bedroom with the door closed and lights off. We had all gotten pretty baked. I had just made myself a snack and was walking to my friend's bedroom, which was right past the mom's room where the couple was. As I walked past the mom's bedroom door, out of the corner of my eye, I saw the door opening from the inside, and a partial head of what looked identical to my friend's mom, who obviously wasn't at home at the time. I didn't think anything of it, since there were so many people in the small apartment, and kept walking and sat in my friend's room. A minute later, the girl who had been screwing around in that bedroom came out and yelled at me and asked me why I had kicked the door open. I told her I saw someone come out of there, and she was adamant that I had walked by and kicked the door open. The more I thought about it, the more weird it was. I thought she was messing with me at first, but the person I saw didn't look like anyone that was there at the time. It looked so much like the mom. If it were her, it would have meant that she had somehow snuck back into the apartment after being gone for hours, hiding in her room in the dark for over an hour while this couple was messing around in her bed. And then she would have had to discreetly left the bedroom and passed the living room full of people to get to the front door. I always thought it was maybe a ghost, but now that I've seen so many stories like this, I'm thinking maybe a doppelganger. I stopped hanging out over there the next year or so I don't know if anything else weird like that happened again. So this happened in December or late November 2020. I was a few minutes late for college, and my mom was with me. However, when I arrived, the fire alarm had gone off, and everyone from the main building had been evacuated. I didn't know if my building had evacuated, so I went across the road, and in the main entrance to ask a staff member what was going on. He told me it was just the main building that had been evacuated, and not mine. So I went upstairs and went to my class. Later on, I spoke to my mom and couldn't remember if she messaged me, or she told me this when she met me after college. But she asked me where I went at the start of the day. I asked what she meant, and she said she saw me walking outside towards another building instead of going to class. She said they had the same bag, clothes, hair, height, that he was identical. I told her I went to class, and she didn't really believe me at first. But I know I went to class, and eventually she ended up believing me. She most likely thinks it was just some strange look-alike, but she doesn't know about doppelgangers and mimics, and after reading some stories on here and other paranormal stories, I'm pretty sure it was something paranormal my mom saw. To make it scarier, I knew from folklore that seeing a doppelganger of yourself most likely means that you're going to die. However, I didn't know what it meant if someone else had seen your doppelganger. So I looked it up, and it means that the person the doppelganger was impersonating is or will become very ill. I had health issues all my life, but never anything serious like a disease, and didn't have any that I knew of at the time. However, just a week ago, I found out that I have gum disease, and it had been causing me to feel nauseous. I even had to go to an emergency appointment to my local dentist. I know that gum disease is due to natural causes. However, the fact that my mom saw the doppelganger meant that I was going to be ill is just too much of a coincidence. Because of my OCD, I do see hallucinations. And if I had seen it myself, I would think I was just hallucinating. However, because my mom saw it, I believe her because she doesn't have a mental illness. She doesn't do drugs and hasn't smoked in over 20 years. She also wasn't drunk, and is not the type of person to make something up. When I was about 16 or 17, I was really heavy into doing the Ouija board. Other stuff happened, but the doppelgangers were definitely the worst. The first one was my mom. I heard her come in, and my best friend was with me. My friend and I walked down to greet her. She looked like a younger version of my mom and was carrying groceries. So I tried calling out to her, but she didn't respond and walked into my brother's room. Then I got a sick feeling. I called out to her, but she didn't respond still. So I followed her up, but she was not there. When I walked back down, my real mom had come in and didn't know what was going on. She was also wearing a different outfit. The next one was my brother. My mom was talking to him on the phone, and he said he was on his way home. As soon as he hung up, my brother walked in the door. He talked to us for a little bit. My mom wanted him to take out the garbage or something. And then he walked to the bathroom. He had been in the bathroom for like 15 minutes. And then I got the sick feeling again. I asked if he had fallen in or something. Then my real brother walked in and was freaked out. My mom checked on him all night to make sure he was okay. Both times they had darker eyes, and it felt sort of like a dream, but I was definitely awake, and other people also saw it. I'm so fucking creeped out right now. What the actual fuck? I was sitting there on my computer when my brother walks in and sits down on his bed. He doesn't say anything. He is a quiet person after all. I go to the bathroom, walk back in, and he's gone. I look outside, and the car that he had left in with my mom a few hours ago still isn't there. I go outside to see if anyone else is home that I could have mistaken him for. And no, I'm still at home, alone. So what the hell? My wife said that she saw me standing in the kitchen, doing something while I was actually at work at the time. She initially thought I had come home from work and was worried, and then this figure of me apparently vanished, which was naturally even more upsetting. No other occurrences before or since then have happened. So I had just gotten real baked at my friend's apartment, walking home in broad daylight. Down the sidewalk ahead of me, I see two young girls, instantly recognizable as Mormon missionaries. They get maybe 50 feet away from me, and one of them waves and calls me by my name. We meet, and one of the girls gives a friendly hello. She acts like she knows me. Bear in mind that I'm pretty stoned, so I'm trying to figure out if I know her from somewhere, but she catches on that I don't recognize her, and she acts kind of offended. So she reminds me that we had some big long conversation on her friend's porch on such and such street just a few days prior. Now at this point in my life, I smoked a lot of weed, but I never drank or did anything else, and going to random parties and charming pretty young blondes was completely off the menu. I was already half in love from the moment she smiled at me. I don't think I would have forgotten this long conversation we apparently had. Now her expression, I remember, as I stumbled through this conversation. At first she thought I was joking, then she thought I was being mean, and then she kind of looked just as confused as I was. So I then suggest, maybe it was my brother you met. She looks at me and says, Not unless he's your identical twin. My brother and I look like brothers, but you'll never confuse one for the other. So we ended up parting ways. I don't remember the other girl ever saying anything. Then it dawns on me. She knew my name. I turn around. They're a few hundred feet away, and I yell, "Wait, how did you know my name?" But they don't hear me, and I foolishly couldn't muster the courage to run to catch up with them. That shit bugged me for weeks. I wanted to know what we had talked about. This is a true story, and I don't care if you don't believe me. About 3 years ago, my husband and I bought a house. Everything's been going good. We're settled in, we're enjoying it, and we haven't had any issues with the house. However, I had 2 experiences in this house that might be paranormal or doppelgangers. What I experienced is family members that I have thought I seen, but they were not actually there, and I'm wondering if anyone has any ideas on what they are. The first one was my husband. I turned into the hallway and saw him there, walking away from me and towards the bedroom at the opposite end. I called to him, but he didn't respond. As soon as he entered the bedroom, he turned to the left, but there was no one there. My husband had been upstairs the entire time. The second time was my dad. He was unloading some things from his truck and was going to bring them to the back door, which opens into the kitchen. I was in the kitchen and heard a noise at the door. Through the window in the door, I saw my dad bending over, as though he was bending down to untie his shoes. I ran to the door and opened it, but there was no one there. I saw my dad was still at his truck. Both times it's been a family member. Both times I haven't seen their face. These events don't feel wrong in any way or sinister. The movements that the figures made were exactly the movements my dad or husband would have made. Does anyone have any ideas or experiences with this sort of thing? Let me know. I wasn't sure where else to post these stories, so I figured I'll share them here. I've been a search and rescue officer for a few years now, and along the way, I've seen some things that I think you guys will be interested in. I have a pretty good track record for finding missing people. Most of the time, they just wander off the path or slip down a small cliff and can't find their way back. The majority of them have heard the old "stay where you are" thing, and they don't wander far off. But I had 2 cases where that didn't happen. Both of these cases bothered me a lot, and I used them as motivation to search even more on the missing person cases I get called on. The first was a little boy who was out berry picking with his parents. He and his sister were together, and both of them went missing around the same time. Their parents lost sight of them for a few seconds, and in that time, both the kids apparently wandered off. When their parents couldn't find them, they called us, and we came out to search the area. We found the daughter pretty quickly, and when we asked where her brother was, she told us that he had been taken away by the bear man. She said he gave her berries and told her to stay quiet, and that he wanted to play with her brother for a while. The last she saw of her brother, he was riding on the shoulders of the bear man and seemed calm. Of course, our first thought was abduction, but we never found a trace of another human being in that area. The little girl was also insistent that he wasn't a normal man, but that he was tall and covered in hair like a bear, and that he had a weird face. We searched the area for weeks It was one of the longest calls I ever been on, but we never found a single trace of that kid. The other was a young woman who was out hiking with her mom and grandpa. According to the mother, her daughter had climbed up a tree to get a better view of the forest, and she had never came back down. They waited at the base of the tree for hours calling her name before they decided to call for help. Again, we searched everywhere, and we never found a trace of her. I have no idea where she could possibly have gone, because nobody, including her mother or grandpa, saw her come down from the tree. A few times, I've been out on my own searching with a canine, and he tried to lead me straight up cliffs, not hills, not even rocky faces, straight, sheer cliffs with no possible handholds. It's always baffling, and in those cases, we sometimes find the person on the other side of the cliff, or miles away from where the canine had led us. I'm sure there's an explanation, but everything's so strange out here. One specific sad case involved the recovery of a body. A 9-year-old girl had fell down and got impaled on a dead tree at the base. It was a complete freak accident, but I'll never forget the sound her mother made when we told her what happened. She saw the body bag being loaded into the ambulance and let out the most haunting, heartbroken cry I ever heard. It was like her whole life was crashing down around her, and a part of her had died with her daughter. I heard from another search and rescue officer that she killed herself a few weeks after it happened. Apparently, she couldn't live with the loss of her daughter. I was teamed up with another search and rescue officer because we received reports of bears in the area. We were looking for a guy who hadn't come home from a climbing trip when he was supposed to, and we ended up having to do some serious climbing to get to where we figured he was. We found him trapped with a broken leg. It wasn't pleasant. He had been there for almost 2 days, and his leg was obviously infected. We were able to get him into a chopper, and I heard from one of the EMT guys that the man was saying strange things. He kept talking about how he had been doing fine, and when he got to the top, a man had been there. He said the guy had no climbing equipment and that he was wearing ski pants. He said he walked up to the guy, and when the guy turned around, he said that the man had no face. It was just blank. He freaked out and ended up trying to get off the mountain too fast, which is why he had fallen. He said he could hear the guy all night climbing down the mountain and letting out these horrible, muffled screams. That story bothered the hell out of me. I'm actually glad I wasn't there to hear him say it. But can you imagine being trapped with a broken leg and hearing a faceless man running up and down beside you, screaming all night? I once led a trip to the top of Mount Sterling in North Carolina. It's a tough climb to get to the top, and about 6 miles from the nearest road. I was leading a group of 8 middle school kids and 1 co-instructor. We were camping out on top of the mountain, and it was a beautiful night with a full moon. The kids and the other co-instructor went to bed in their tents. I chose to spend the night in a hammock that night. I was really into a book I was reading, so I stayed up and read until about 10:30 p.m. I turned my headlamp off to settle in for the night. Everything around me was rather bright from the moon and from the position I was in. I could see down the trail we had hiked to get to the top. I lay there enjoying the scenery and noticed something moving along the trail. Bears are common in the area, so I perked up. As it got closer, I could tell it was a person. We were in the middle of nowhere, and there was someone hiking up the trail with no headlamp or any gear. I was just frozen, watching this person move closer to our camp. They arrived at the top of the mountain where we were and just stopped. I watched as what appeared to be a man surveyed our camp. I really could only see the outline of him. He stood there for what seemed like 30 minutes, but may have been 10. He then turned and sat down under a tree, facing our camp. He was sitting up in a way that I knew he wasn't trying to sleep. He just sat there, staring at our camp. I had no idea what to do, so I decided to wait it out. And I waited, just staring at the man, while he stared at my camp. This went on until about 3:30 a.m. Then he stood up, took a moment to survey my camp a few minutes longer, and then went back down the trail he came up on. I, to this day, have no idea what that was all about, but it freaked me out. I was paranoid that we were being followed for the rest of the trip. There was a group of teens that hadn't been heard from after their scheduled return time from a camping trip. A coworker and I head out into the general direction the teens had set off in. We had been hiking for most of the day and seen nothing. We're about 35 kilometers into the woods at this point when we start noticing strange things. Sticks carved like spears stuck into the ground, weird carvings in the trees, a child stuffed animal hanging from a noose up in a tree. This place was nowhere near any roads. It wasn't on the regular trails people would go on in the area. The really eerie thing was that everything was freshly carved. Somebody had been there within a couple of hours of us and made these things. Mind you, we're still looking for those teens. We kept on hiking and eventually made camp for the night. Still kind of on edge from what we had seen earlier, but we settled down anyway and go to sleep. We get up with the sunrise, hoping to cover more ground before it gets too hot. We pack up the gear and get ready to go, when I noticed a bit of a shirt that had caught on a small tree and ripped along with some shoe prints. We were thinking, great, maybe we're close by the teens, when a radio call comes through. The teens had just been found 20 kilometers east of us, and now they're calling everybody back. All those weird things we had seen from the day before came flooding back into my mind, and we wasted no time hiking out of those woods. I'm a ranger at Yellowstone. A couple of weeks ago, I was exploring the Lamar Valley, about 11 miles from the nearest road, and even further to the park. There, in the middle of the trail, is a perfectly severed deer head. No blood, nothing, no ragness at the severed head, perfectly intact. This is weird because I've seen many wolf and bear spoils, and I used to find cougar prey remains in South Dakota with radio tracking just after the cougar made them. This was not any of those things. This head was completely uneaten. Eyes, tongue, everything was still intact. Even the ravens hadn't touched it yet. right smack in the middle of the trail. And again, no blood. Even a human doing it made no conventional sense. It was a doe, so it had no antlers. Plus, why leave it in the trail? The whole thing, even in broad daylight, gave me chills. Just an ocean of waving grass, bison calmly grazing, and a perfectly clean deer head right on the middle of the path. Our park lets kids from school in so they can look for animals in the forest and the streams. One day, a kid finds molars. The teeth look like they belong to a human, but the teacher said they were a deer's. I dismissed it and completely forgot about it. 2 days later, they found a body with a smashed skull and jaw in another part of the park. All its teeth were missing. A local newspaper covered it, but all they had to say was thank the spooky skeletons for good bones and teeth. I found a deceased man in a tree. I am a seasonal ranger for my local forest district. The rest of the rangers say we found about one self-harm victim a year. So here was the one for this year. When we go around opening parks each day, we drive through to make sure everything is okay. In this instance, I was driving through and had just lost sight of the road when I saw a man hanging from a tree in a clearing. He had hung himself. I called the cops. The medical examiner took an hour to show up, and he was the only one with a ladder long enough to cut the guy down. So basically, I stared at a dead body in a tree for an hour. I was surveying a remote restoration site near an old trail, and I heard someone walking up a nearby road. All the hair on the back of my neck stood up, so I grabbed all my stuff and started casually walking down the trail like I belonged there. I turned the corner and there was a shirtless guy swinging a crowbar around in circles. And when he saw me, he started yelling, "I got a crowbar, I got a crowbar." I think I nodded at him, squeaked something like, "Nice crowbar," and then I ran the mile or so back to my truck. A shed behind an abandoned house with a steel reinforced door broken off the hinges. The windows of the shed were boarded up from the outside. The only thing inside the shed was a queen-size bed with shredded white sheets. I'll never forget that night. I am a park ranger, and that is all you will learn about me, aside from this story. During the summer of 2008, I had been assigned to a watchtower in the middle of a heavily forested area. Most nights, it was uneventful, and I tended to just read a book as I waited for my shift to end. However, this night, when I started my shift, the guy I took over from was shaken up. Concerned, I asked what was wrong. All he did was shake his head and said, "There are things in the woods." He didn't say anything else and just left me standing there like a jackass. Jerk. Well, I set up for the night and took out my book. It was The Mailman, and I found myself surprised by how much I enjoyed it. Sometime around an hour into my shift, something struck the window. I jumped up and quickly sat the book down. Before checking it out, I had expected it was either a big bug or some poor bird. It was a bird, alright, but not what I had been expecting at all. This bird was dead long before it had collided with the window, both wings torn right off and stripped of all feathers. It was bound together with straps made from long grass blades. This was the clear evidence that this was man-made. I quickly took out my flashlight and began scanning the area beneath me. I couldn't see much through the woods. However, as I did a quick double take, I swear, I saw a dark shape dart away from the light. I feel this needs some elaborating. I could barely make out anything, but when I brought my light over this thing, I only got a brief glimpse. I literally couldn't describe it for the life of me. This thing was fast. Too fast. Alright, listen up, you punks. If you're out there, show yourself right now. I used my most commanding voice possible. Nothing. As I drew my pistol, I heard the radio crackle. Naturally, I went to check and picked up the receiver. As I held it up to my ear, I could only hear static, so I at first assumed it was a glitch. But right as I decided to set it down, something stopped me. Call it intuition, something just wasn't right. And then I realized what it was. I could hear something over the radio. It was faint, so I really had to strain to hear it. Slowly, I could make out what sounded like faint, low humming. There was a pattern to it, a steady beat that started low, building up, then carefully dropped back down in an instant. I don't know how long I was listening to that humming sound, but eventually I turned off the radio, ready to radio it in. Then I realized I could still hear the humming. Without a second thought, I drew my pistol and turned around on my heel before steadily walking back outside. That humming sound sounded like it was all around me, following that same pattern. I still had to strain to make it out, but there was no question it was there. I swiveled around, pistol aimed at empty air. Every part of me was screaming to call for backup, but I wasn't sure what I needed backup for. I needed some proof of what I was dealing with, so I waited, on guard and ready, and then it stopped. As I became accustomed to the silence, I couldn't hear anything, not even a bug chirping. Cautiously turning my flashlight back on, I pointed it down at the base of the tower. Nothing. Nothing whatsoever. Then I heard a creak. I immediately spun around, processing this information. At first, I dismissed it as the wood, but then there was another creak, and another. Something was up here with me. It took me a few moments to realize that it was just around the corner. In that moment, fight or flight kicked in full gear, and I chose fight. I rounded the corner and found nothing. Absolutely nothing. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I was nervous, but I still had a job to do. And with no other option, I decided to call for backup, which I should have done that a long time ago. I realized that when I saw the receiver had been cut right off, I stared, dumbfounded by a few moments, before grabbing my walkie-talkie instead. But when I turned it on, all I got was a harsh whine right in my ear, which caused me to drop it as I recovered. Once I had, I immediately tried to find it, but it was gone. My situation was desperate. I was now completely cut off with some thing or other that seemed to defy all sense. If I was going to make it out of this, I had to stay put and wait for someone to come check on me. I still had my pistol drawn, waiting and waiting. I then quickly shined my flashlight outside one last time, and this time, I finally saw them, standing among the trees, staring up at me. They had been avoiding me all this time, so to see so many of them, you might be wondering what they were. And I'd rather not tell you, for my sake. I was at my limit then, and screamed, turning off my flashlight and pointing my gun right at the door. There, I stayed for the rest of my shift, unwilling to move from that spot. I consider it a miracle I lasted for the rest of my shift. By the time someone finally arrived to see why I wasn't checking in, I poured out every single thing I had gone through. At first, the other ranger looked at me like I was crazy, but when he asked if I had any proof, something landed on the roof of his vehicle. It was another dead, naked, and wingless bird wrapped in grass. Needless to say, we booked it right out of there. When I got back and made a report about what happened, I demanded to speak with the last guy who had been on the previous ship. I really wanted him to have it for not warning me of what was out there. But here's the thing, we never found him. We searched high and low, checked every single record for a trace. We tried to look up his name when we could remember it, but it seemed like he never existed in the first place. So, what the hell took his shift? My older sister, who is Irish, Italian, recently got married. Not her first, to this guy who is Navajo. Shortly after they settled down together, she has a boy from her first marriage. They invite me to hang out with them down on the reservation, where her new husband has a house and some property. I ended up bringing a few friends. Being a white guy, I know nothing about native or skinwalker lore. One of the friends that comes along, Gregory, however, is into horror and demons, things like that, and knows all these different werewolf, vampire, and even skinwalker stories. That first night, with not much else to do, we are out in the middle of a few 100,000 acres of hills and wooded land. We end up sitting around a small bonfire, with him telling us one story after the next. The next day, we all take a walk to the elementary school to bring my nephew home. My sister usually picks him up, but she has some errands to run. Along the way, we pass this scraggly looking dude sitting beneath this tree beside the road. He looks kind of old, but in a way that is difficult to say just how old. Regardless, it's definitely creepy the way he's watching us. His eyes kind of flat and dull, as if unaffected by the sunlight. As we make our way back from the school, my nephew seems pretty quiet and shy. When he sees this guy, he ducks behind me and starts tugging on my shirt. I ask him what's up, and without taking his eyes off the guy, he whispers, "I don't like that man. He's bad." The way he said it gives me chills, but I really don't think all that much more about it. Well, that night, Gregory and my other two friends, Jeff and Sarah, and I all head out to go check out this abandoned part of the reservation, which supposedly is haunted. We had been warned not to by my brother-in-law. He says it is an inhabited place of ghosts of the past and some kind of dark being. Of course, that only serves to make us want to go even more. So we dismiss his warnings and ghost stories take the keys to my sister's SUV, and off we go. When we first get there, I have to admit, it is a lot spookier looking and feeling than any one of us had expected, consisting of only a handful of abandoned structures, most of the faded and graying wood, and the biggest of which is only 2 stories. It looks to me to have been some sort of mining town, like the kind that you see on westerns on TV. Anyways, just about every window is completely busted out, with only a shared appointed pane hanging here and there. There isn't a single door still in place, and definitely not an item of any value anywhere to be seen. In fact, there isn't much of anything at all. As we walk around, going up to and looking into some of the places, but not entering, Jeff takes us to telling us how this reminds him of one of his past flings with some girl. Sarah and I roll our eyes, as we always do when he starts waxing old memories, and then goes off a little ways, leaving him and Gregory together. We find a cozy corner out of sight and start getting comfortable, if you know what I mean. We are going at it for all 5 seconds when we both notice it has suddenly turned chill. Just as we huddle together for warmness, we hear a blood-curdling scream. We jump up and run back into the direction of the SUV and where we last saw Gregory and Jeff. There, they are facing the remains of the storefront, their eyes staring straight ahead and oblivious to the fact that we are there. Sarah and I both look to where they are staring, and we see this creature, that it is a wolf-like creature, but yet not being a wolf completely. I'm still not sure to this day if it was real or not. Either way, I for one am scared, as I have never been in my life. Its body is fully covered in hair, and it had these long wraith-like fingers, which end in thick curled nails, definitely claw-like. Its head is the worst though. Its eyes are just these 2 chunks of dark coal, flat, and emotionless. Its mouth is full of small daggers. I'm not sure how long we stand there frozen. Finally, it takes a step forward, and as if released from some spell, we bolt to the truck. Jeff and I jump into the front seat, he to the driver's side, and me in the passenger, while Gregory and Sarah go for the back. Jeff doesn't have his license, but at that point no one's arguing. The keys are in the ignition. He starts the SUV, floors the gas, and we speed off gravel and sand flying everywhere. I look out the window on my side, and then all around. I see nothing through the cloud of dust and the darkening twilight. When I turn to look back at Gregory, the only thing he could think to say is, "You got some lipstick on your chin." Just down the road some, Jeff slows the truck. By this time we are all laughing and making fun of each other for running away from shadows. Just then, a look of fright comes over Sarah's face, and without saying a word, she points a trembling finger out towards the trees along the side of the road. There, back in the dark of the trees, is where we see the shadow-like figure running just inside the tree line, as if it's keeping pace with us, and we all yell in unison to Jeff, and he again presses down on the gas. The SUV springing to life, but that thing, whatever it is, stays with us every inch of the way. It is only when we see the lights to my sister's porch that making the turn off to her. When we pull up to the house, my brother-in-law is out on the porch with this guy dressed in a long-sleeve button white shirt, blue jeans, and work boots. He later introduces himself as the local shaman. When we get up to the porch, the guy is in the middle of some kind of blessing. When he finishes, my brother-in-law simply turns to us and says, "Now you know, maybe next time you'll listen." Later, after the shaman leaves, he admonishes us, saying that by telling the skinwalker stories, we put everyone out there in danger. He said just mentioning them can make them come and seek you out. When I was a child, it was just me and my mother. We lived in a property owned by my grandma, a 3-story old farmhouse right at the fringe of the woods. It was far off the road, down a long, unlit gravel driveway. It felt very isolated at night, being so distant from any other houses. It was set in an area that wasn't inhabited for 30 years before we started living in it. Quite often, I was a fairly rambunctious child, so while my mom went off to work, I would occasionally skip the morning bus to school and stay home alone all day. The big house had a habit of feeling incredibly lonely, so I spent most of my time playing in the forest, out in the back. Some distance into the woods, far enough that I could hear my mother when she called. There was a toppled pine tree which had crashed into another. An even larger trunk on its way down was now frozen there, forming a long arc over the forest floor. I loved to climb up the jagged stump at the base of this fallen tree and then steady myself to a point just above the middle. I was never able to make it all the way to the top because it just got too steep for me to continue any further, and I had a bad habit of freaking out from how high up I was. One day, I was sitting in my usual spot on the fallen tree, which was a good distance from the ground, just listening to the birds singing and simultaneously feeling the warmth of the sun on my neck, when I heard something strange from underneath that paralyzed me in shock. Hey kid. I was gripped by a sudden strong surge of fear for a moment. The voice had come from directly underneath me. I strained to look down, but I couldn't see anything over the ledge. For a long time, I just sat there in absolute silence, and I was at the point where I was almost soon to convince myself that I had imagined hearing a man's voice at all. I know you can hear me. His voice was much louder this time, as I yelled something out and scrambled up the log a bit higher. Trembling nervously, I dug my fingernails into the bark and held tight for dear life. I sat there, trying to collect my nerves for God knows how long. Even though I couldn't see it, the presence of the thing underneath me was still clear, was much softer and more cautious this time. And when I listened closely, I swear I could hear the faintest echo of a human breathing. Gathering all my courage, I vowed to prove to myself that it was all my imagination by leaning over the ledge as far as I possibly could without slipping right off. Digging hard into the bark behind me, I stretched out along my arms and peered over, getting a full view of the empty forest floor and undergrowth, when suddenly, "Come down here or I'll come up and grab you." It was so loud. It was as if it was being screamed right in my face. I released my grip on the tree in fright and plunged off the platform. I was saved only by grabbing a nearby branch, and for one awful second, my bare legs dangled in the cool air. When I pulled myself up, I ran at full speed to the top of the collapsed pine, to the point I had never reached before. I sat there, just below the rustling canopy, pissing myself and staring at the distant base where the splintered wood rose, fully expecting at any moment to see someone crawling rapidly up the pine towards me. Instead, all I heard was the wind whistling in the leaves above and below me, and occasional snippets of birdsong. It was about 2 hours before my mother got home and found me. After much worry, searching, trembling, and crying at the top of the fallen tree. Although this incident spooked both me and my mother, in time I somehow recovered, exhibiting the naive hard skin of a child, even though I never went as far into the forest as I used to, and never again even approached that fallen tree. Once, when I was 12, I had the chore of taking firewood from the shed out back, just at the edge of the woods, and to bring it back inside the house. It was a tiresome job, and I always chose to do it at dusk, when the air was brimming with mosquitoes and a swampy fog that usually coated the lawn. By the time I had my last round, I would sprint back to the house, spooked. One of my least favorite things about this job was that the shed was full of barn owls. If you have never seen a barn owl's face staring at you from a dark roof corner, then you will know how uncomfortable that shed made me. One of these nights, it got mistier than it had ever been before. A thick silver fog covered everything and limited my line of sight to a short sphere around me. Even though the shed wasn't far from the house, I found myself feeling disoriented, and more than once, I walked in the wrong direction, both times for some reason, walking straight into the woods. By the time I had reached my last load, it was too foggy to see the street. My eyes stung in the moisture, and it made my vision blur. Lurching forward, I managed to walk headfirst into a tree. Doubling over and dropping all of the wood I was bundling onto my feet with a hard crunch. As I went to pick them up, with my foot throbbing pretty hard, I realized that the ground was too misty for me to see my own knees. I decided to head to the house since we had more than enough wood for one night. However, it was getting to be pretty dark, and I couldn't make out any signs of which direction I was heading in. Even though I cautiously walked for several feet in all directions, trying to figure out my position in the mist, I still couldn't figure out any point of identification. I couldn't even locate the fence or the gate, and the more I walked, the more I seemed to stumble into trees, pine needles, and mud crunching under my feet instead. After a while, I finally realized that I couldn't even find the shed anymore. Cursing myself for being so dumb while trying to ignore my thumping heart and sense that something else was at play, I became aware that I was lost somewhere in the forest. I then started screaming out for my mother at the loudest possible volume I could, but was only met with a resounding silence from the depths of the mist all around from where I stood, affirming that I had wandered too far from the house to be heard. As a deep panic started to settle on me, I noticed a glimpse of something pink moving against a nearby pine trunk. Coming closer, I saw that it was a ripped out square of pink paper. On it, there was an arrow pointing left. It looks vaguely like something my mom would make, I rationalized to keep me from getting lost. So I followed the direction set by that green arrow, shivering in the increasing cold. I kept walking for about 5 to 10 minutes before needing to stop to take a breath. My heart was pounding so fast, it was beginning to hurt. As I was sitting down, however, I spied what appeared to be another note hanging on a nearby trunk. I noticed this one was embedded with a long nail. It bore another arrow, this one pointing up, and a small, sloppy written note that said, "This way." Despite my increasing panic, I convinced myself that these notes were my only shot at getting back before nightfall. I was desperate to get the hell out, and my eyebrows were cold with sweat, so I followed the green arrow to a point where I could just dimly make out another spot of pink up an incline of collapsed stumps and leaf litter. At this point, it was getting pretty dark, and I had to strain both my eyes just to see a few meters ahead of me, following the green arrows, feeling more and more lost of where I was. I stumbled through the woods, groping out in the mist to feel for trees, even though I was terrified of something unseen grabbing my arm. I came across the third green note, which had another arrow pointing up again. This one led to a steep slope that I didn't recognize being anywhere near my house, and it was with a poorly drawn smiley face right above it. At this stage, I became too freaked to cope and started to cry there a little as I slumped against the pine stump. The possibility that I would be out in these woods all night was beginning to sink in, like a syringe being driven into the veins within my arm. I caught a glimpse of another pink square in the near distance. Squinting hard, despite the previous week's nonstop rain, I read it from afar. What I read made my blood turn cold. I stood to my knees, dead silently, wobbling on them in fear. My ears were sensitive to any tiny prickle of noise in the mist. For a long time, I stood there in the rolling fog, reading that horrible note over and over again, until a snapping stick somewhere behind me caused me to sprint blindly, twigs snapping at my ankles and cutting up my face as I ran. Written on the note in big green letters was my name. It felt like I was running for hours. All the while, the rain and mist lapped at the back of my neck like the decaying breath of someone running right behind me. Somehow, I made it back to the house. All the lights were off, and I struggled to find the keys for a moment. When I found them, I bolted indoors and quickly crawled into bed, where I remained unsleeping till morning. My mom just thought I had come inside and gone to bed and hadn't thought to leave the lights on. It was a miracle, aka some freakish coincidence, that I even found the house that night at all. The final incident at that damn house was witnessed only by my mother. Up until then, she had never experienced any of the strange things as I had, even though we mutually shared the same oppressive quality that the house's interior had on us and its placement in the woods. Although I was obviously never a popular kid, by living way out in the country in the opposite direction from everyone else at my school, I did make some tight friends in my first year of high school. One of these friends, Amanda was her name, invited me over one night and I accepted. My mother drove me out to the place, which was about 3 miles away, then drove back home. The night went well. We watched a horror movie, devoured some pizza, smoked a little pot. My mother went home alone, where she intended to get some writing done. She worked for a magazine at that point. It was about midnight when I received an off-putting text from Mom in all caps. "Is this a prank? I need to know immediately." Thinking it was some kind of joke, I texted back, "Calm yourself. Is what a prank?" She responded immediately, "Are you at the house?" Of course, I responded no. I didn't receive another message until around 3 a.m. when she told me to go to my grandma's in the morning and to not by any means dare go home. I remember those drops of rain the day I went to my grandmother's and how terribly soaked I was when I finally got there. It was nearly 2 towns away. I had to fight the temptation to go home and drop off my bags. But Mom's disturbing messages from last night were enough of a warning not to do so. When I arrived, Mom and Grandma were having lunch. At first, my mother seemed to be in some sort of a composed state, but when I got a better look at her, I noticed that all of the color had drained from her face and she was slightly trembling. At one point, she even sent a small glass crashing to the floor after flinching at the cat brushing around her ankles. It wasn't until later that night, when my grandma was sound asleep, that she told me what happened. She even went further as to forbid me from telling old grandma, out of fear that it would horrify her superstitious soul too much. This was what happened the night when I was at Amanda's, and she described it in detail. My mother was sitting on the first story in the living room, where she sat on the couch by the fire, curtains open to the view of the sunset on the canopy, going over her latest draft. At first, it was so faint that she barely noticed it, but after a while, my mother became aware and vaguely irritated by tiny thumping noises near her head at the window. When she went over to investigate, she saw a fat brown moth of a kind we often get at that place, buzzing madly into the glass. Reasoning that this was the cause of the sound, she returned to her work, however, feeling rattled in some way. It was when the noises started to get sharper and louder that she paid more attention and saw that rocks were being thrown at the window from the total blackness of the forest edge. She saw them appear from the shadows of the bush and then fall in an arc and bounce off the window. Looking carefully, she could see some cracks from where some heavy ones had hit, right beside where her head had been moments before. Captivated, she tried to peer into the darkness enough to make out where the rocks were being thrown from. Then, with a startled shock, she jumped back from the window as she saw me standing half behind a tree right near the window, grinning wide and staring at her. My one visible eye stretched wide open, showing all the white. She barely let out a scream, seeing her own daughter standing there, just staring and smiling. Not only did this figure not move or blink, it was standing by one of the nearest pines, far from where the rocks were shooting up out of the bush, as they continued to do so in a loud downpour. My face continued to press out at her, smiling, thinking this was all some kind of sick prank. My mother shouted my name at the top of her lungs. However, instead of responding, the mouth of this thing behind the tree just started moving, as if it were saying words silently, really, really fast. Suddenly, it turned its head to the side, and it seemed to be speaking with someone else behind the tree, my mom said, who couldn't be seen. But she could see a formless black shape hanging against the other side of the tree. The girl that looked like me kept staring at my mother and doing the silent, speed-talking thing, then turning and whispering to the thing next to her. Then she would turn back and start up again. Breaking the spell, she suddenly pointed straight at my mother and started laughing. My mother screamed and fled to my bedroom on the second story, where she shut herself in and sat at the far end of the bed as the rocks began to pitter-patter against the window downstairs. In my room, my mother said she did not feel safe. There was an awful smell and a weird humming noise in the walls, as she described. She tried to pray for a time before giving up and just listening to the rocks pelt the walls and windows. Somewhere in the kitchen, she caught the distinct sound of a window actually smashing and the weird, continuous humming. Listening more carefully, she could identify it as the softest hint of a mumbling voice. In absolute horror, she recognized the voice, and then, too afraid to look, she tilted her head up to the closet door, where an awful, white face could be seen staring right at her, with its mouth contorting and gapping in what sounded like Heidi sped up whispering. The closet door was only a meter from my mother. It then started to open slowly. My mother immediately bolted to the door, only to fumble with the lock as bigger and bigger rocks came crashing through the window, which burst apart in a spray of glass shards before finally getting out. Running out the house, completely keeping her eyes off the woods, getting into her vehicle and driving off. She said as she glanced back right at the end of the drive, and she saw two unmistakable human forms standing at my broken bedroom window, watching as her vehicle got further and further away from our house. This would be their final farewell, as my mother never stepped foot in that place again. As my mother told this story, she broke down into tears. I didn't doubt her, and I still don't. I truly believe that she experienced what she said she did. It was also quite clear that we were done living in that house for once and for all. I only went back once with my dad, who I rarely see now. He came from another state to help us move. Mom had already found a place in town and moved in. My dad and I just loaded up his truck with all that was left inside there. It was silent, sunny morning when we removed all the stuff and emptied the place. I wish I could say there was some closure, some final spooking to cap it all off, but there wasn't. It was just a relief to be out of there. There are, however, two things that I have to mention. When we checked the house for any signs of intruders, we found that several windows, including one in my bedroom and the kitchen, had been smashed and rocks were lying on the floor. 2. Dad went out into the trees for a bit to take a leak. When he came back, he asked me how long we had the swing set for. Needless to say, we never had a swing set, so I was fairly unsettled to discover that in the weeks since we had been gone, someone had assembled a rope swing set from one of the highest branches of the old pine over the ridge, against which was the fallen log I had stopped climbing many years ago. It was obviously new rope and a nicely polished, sanded down wooden set. Dad, wanting to keep my mind from recent events, said that a neighbor maybe set it up, not realizing it was on our property. Of course, he knew as well as I did that we had no neighbors for at least a mile in any direction. There were no houses in all that space, and never in my time living there did I ever see any other signs of humans living. But I let it all go and was pleased enough just to say good riddance to that horrible place as we drove off for good. For the most part, I found it best to try and forget what happened at that place. Sometimes, I just can't help but ponder it, even though it's been long enough now that I no longer feel scared talking about it. But for a long while, I couldn't. My grandma just recently sold the house to a new family, that being a young couple and their little son, shortly after we moved out. Despite my mother's desperate insistence that it be left empty, now she refuses to talk about what happened altogether. I'm less anxious about it, even though sometimes I can't help but let my imagination get the better of me. All I can do is think of that old house, the fallen down tree, the new family that moved in, and the swing out back, gently spinning in the breeze, as that little boy toddles, obviously, towards it.